Good evening, and thank you for joining us for another Cleveland Public Library, the Next 400 digital discussion. My name is Chris Tanaka, primary evening anchor for 19 News. Our guests tonight, two esteemed colleagues from here in the Cleveland community, Danielle Sydnor, who is the president of the Cleveland NAACP, and Daniel Gray-Kontar, who's currently the executive artistic director of 12 Literary Arts. He's an educator, mentor, and activist in Cleveland. We come to you tonight on the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. This night was selected very intentionally by the planning committee at 19 News and the Cleveland Public Library for the symbolism and for everything that has gone on in the past year and what more must be done here in Cleveland and across our country for better equity, better lives, better communities. Want to get going tonight simply by asking each of you if you have had moments of reflection today on what has transpired in this last year, and when you look back on it, what do you think of and what comes to mind? Danielle, I'd love to begin with you.
So, Chris, thank you for helping to lead this discussion this evening. And so I think the thing that I reflected on today is the same amount of energy that was present in the hours and days after the murder of George Floyd only sort of came about today from inquiries of like, so what are you guys doing again? Like, who are you celebrating the anniversary? It seemed very conjured. And the number of reporters that I got calling me, and I felt like the last minute today to have conversations about the deaths of George Floyd, when there are so many things that have happened over the last year that still need to be done to try and get justice. And I'm not getting the same level of energy and phone calls relative to those things. And so it just, to me, very clearly demonstrates that there is some level of performative, really, activism that took place last year, and we're starting to see it rear up again on this, commemorative day and anniversary, unfortunately.
Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chris. So I have to be very honest in saying, I think I sit in a very different seat. Danielle and I both, we're in the work every day. And today, to be honest with you, was no different day than any other day with respect to thinking about and doing the work of community transformation and transformation for people of color in this city and in this country. Every single day, we're thinking about the work. Every single day, we're doing the work. Every single day, we're fighting to make sure that people of color, specifically Black people in this city, are understanding that they have a voice, that voice matters, and that we have to always do the work of making sure that those voices are authentically heard. That's an everyday experience, an everyday dynamic. So the fact that today is the anniversary of a really horrible date in Black American and American history doesn't change that. It hasn't changed that at all, because the work continues. But it's a great question, Chris. I'm so glad you asked it. But I haven't had a moment to reflect on the anniversary. Because today is a day like many others.
One thing I think that's fascinating is how you both are leaders in our community and are approaching the same goal from two very different positions. And one thing I was able to talk with Danielle about before we came on was that throughout these discussions we've been having with the Cleveland Public Libraries, we have intentionally brought together community leaders and stakeholders who have differing viewpoints and differing expertise areas and different professional backgrounds to share these viewpoints. And it's a fascinating start to this conversation, simply because of the grassroots work you do with individuals, Daniel, And oftentimes, Danielle, with the role you're forced to play, or I shouldn't say forced, the role you do play in responding to media inquiries, in having, macrocosmic, right, views and steering that barge, if you will, down the path. So it's interesting that you have different opinions on that. I took a moment this morning to think about, what have I done? How have I changed? How have I become better? And then the thing that I continue to strive for every day is involvement and intent. Individually, as individuals, how do we remain involved? How do we remain intentional? And how do organizations do the same thing? Daniel.
Wow, that's a great question. So how do we remain involved? I think that, to be very honest with you, and going back to this really sort of grassroots oriented method that you spoke of, I think that it really is about making sure that we're uplifting our neighbors. I think just really being super intentional about making sure that we're present for our neighbors, so that we are able to support one another through this. In conversations that I have with folk, one of the things that's been keeping them going is their capacity to be able to listen to others who are immediately around them, and to hold up and lift each other up, to just check in. How are you? How are you feeling today? How is your brother who is struggling? And I got your back. And so that is truly how we can continue to be involved. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything super macro, but just by doing that for one another, we are keeping each other engaged. And I really believe that it begins there.
Yeah. Danielle, involvement and engagement is big for you.
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple of things that I think about on the involvement question. Number one, we saw a total increase in influx of membership and support after George Floyd was murdered. And I want to go back to something that Daniel said about the fact that this becomes another day for us. And it's similar to questions I was asked last year of like, how do you feel? And I'm like, I have felt devastated every single time. I feel devastated when my kids leave my house with my car and call me at 1 o'clock in the morning because they've been pulled over by police. I've been living a life of feeling devastated. So while many people, especially in the white community who had not been impacted with what we were normally feeling on a regular basis, had a very deeply moving moment last year, for many of us who are intently in this work, this is just a constant reminder of the fact that we often don't get justice. We don't expect to receive justice. And so I think a lot of what we have focused on is the sigh of relief that we collectively breathed when Derek Chauvin was found guilty. But so involvement for me is thinking about this like any other effort. We make donations every year to try and find cures for cancer, but people feel like they made a one-time donation to an organization last year in honor of George Floyd and everything got better. It didn't. We need you to keep making contributions like you did last year. Or people made space for folks inside their organizations to have these discussions as if it was a one-time occurrence. It's not. Somebody else was murdered the day that George Floyd's murderer was found guilty. We have new evidence coming out from Louisiana about Ronald Green, whose family has been trying to get justice for 2 years. So while George Floyd's murder is an inflection point in America for sure, because more people and people around the world paid attention, we need to keep doing all the things that we did last year regularly, like we would when we're trying to find a cure or trying to find relief for any other major issue. It cannot be a one-time thing.
Yeah.
If I can, Chris, I'm not interested in sounding trite or simple. And I just want to really dive into why it's important for us to engage one another. on a very human level. Like I really need to like signify why that's important. And it's really very important because we have been pulled apart. And so when you're pulled apart, it makes you feel as though you're alone. And that loneliness, that feeling that I'm alone, that I'm isolated, is part and parcel of what it is that makes a human being believe that their voice doesn't matter. And so when we can begin to break that down inside neighborhoods, and particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods, and neighborhoods of people of color, if we can begin to see ourselves once again as authentic neighbors and really doing the work of being a neighbor, then that begins to create the kinds of mechanisms where folks can trust, where folks can feel as though they have one another's back, where communities and neighborhoods are rebuilt on a human level. And that is how we can start. Start by being a good neighbor to each other. And that's not saying that that's not happening, but more, please, is really what we need authentically. And that turns into voice growing and talking back, talking to each other and speaking out and organizing once and for all.
Yeah. Of course, everything that's happened in the last year occurred under a confluence of conditions that this country has never seen before. A public health crisis not seen since the 1918-1919 pandemic. A political cycle that was wrought with misinformation, with campaigns of hatred and division, and a racial justice movement that was met rather antagonistically across the country by police forces in many instances, and in many federal agent forces is seen up in the Pacific Northwest. How then do we come back from this trauma to be good neighbors, not only to connect emotionally, intellectually, but also, Danielle, to galvanize and to do more and to engage? How does that happen? Is it a handshake? Is it a wave? Is it community activism in an organization? What is it?
So I want to build on what Daniel said, because especially like last year, again, I keep looking at what's different. The number of phone calls that I got to come speak inside of corporations or organizations who wanted to know, like, what is it that we can do? And people are looking for these big answers. But most of the things that have been difficult for me in my life are the one-on-one incidences of microaggression and being dehumanized and being devalued that I have experienced in singular interactions. And so if we can begin to do the things like he said, in terms of waving, it's one of the suggestions I give all the time to people. If you're living in the Cleveland area, you're likely in a mostly segregated community. So let's start with that, right? We have to be honest about that. So you may not really know Black people well outside of the ones that you work with. And so depending upon how close you get at work, you don't know them well. You know them in a working relationship. So in your community, if you start by doing the things like waving and acknowledging my humanity, like I see you, you see me, it becomes much easier to say, hey, when you're going on vacation, if you want to have your packages left at my door, that's cool, and I can bring them over to you later. Like normal things that we used to do before we were so polarized and before we started to see each other as these things besides just human beings. And so, yes, a wave goes a long way. The thing that I have a hard time with, Chris, is when people act as if that's the end of it. Like, well, I did wave, but that's just the beginning. We have to acknowledge that these things are the beginning and not the end of the work that we're trying to have accomplished, because then it leads to the ability to walk alongside me in authenticity, as opposed to, I just don't want to be the person on the street without the Black Lives Matter sign. So let me put one up too.
Yeah. Daniel, you're smiling. What's the thought and emotion behind the smile?
Danielle just turned around and preached right at the choir. It can't stop there. It is a beginning, as a matter of fact. And it really is also, it is about the authentic listening. It is about sharing and hearing one another's story, no matter how different or no matter how painful those stories may be to hear. So when I was speaking earlier, I was speaking primarily about those very segregated neighborhoods that Danielle was just speaking of. When I'm in Huff or when I'm here in Glenville, most of the folks around me are Black folks. So I'm speaking to them. Let's engage one another as neighbors. But for those of us who live across the river, that's a bit more challenging because we have been geographically divided, and we've been divided in terms of the way that we think in space, in geographical space.
Yeah.
We've been taught to otherize, and that is built literally within the framework, within the foundation of the way in which the city is built and manifests itself into our thinking, into our otherizing one another. So how do we combat that? We have to begin to teach our youth and our adults who will listen what it means and what it looks like to authentically listen. Because when we're unable to authentically listen, we're unable to really truly participate in this democratic experiment. And we're certainly unable to bridge the racial divide or any other divides that we may have. So part of it is a sort of education about what it means to authentically listen and what the impact to authentic listening to one another can have. So we were talking a bit, and I don't want to steal your thunder, Chris, but we were talking a little bit about the House bill that I'm sure you're going to talk about in just a bit.
Yeah.
And part of the difficulty with that House bill to potentially eradicate critical race and teaching critical race theory is it strips us of our humanity. It literally strips us of our ability to hear the stories and the struggles and the aspirations of people who are not like you. And when you are stripped of that, you are literally stripped of your humanity and your capacity to truly participate in this democracy.
Yeah. What Daniel was just speaking about was HB 322 that was just introduced today by Ohio State Representative Don Jones, which would, in essence, ban K through 12 education of critical race theory, or as stated in the bill, would prohibit any state agency, school district, or school from teaching, instructing, or training any administrator, teacher, staff member, or employee to adopt or believe in any of the following concepts, including one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. This bill's intent is to wipe out racism and sexism from our education. To me, it's not only appalling, it's incredibly dangerous. And I'd like your reaction to this. And, you know, as I read it, being mixed race Japanese American, you know, we get about 2 sentences in American history books to talk about internment camps. 2 sentences isn't enough. Who wants to make it 0? There's danger involved in this, and there are forces of suppression that are actively on the move across this country. 41 states, 250 plus bills to suppress voter registration and voting across the country. We're now seeing this in Ohio, where they don't want to have students educated on racism and sexism in our country. Is there a threat that harmony, door-to-door, could lead to complacency in legislation where these battles are being fought?
I don't think that harmony door-to-door leads to complacency. I think it leads to a higher level of awareness, and it breaks your ability to actually pay attention, because critical race theory does not suppress what white people benefit from. Right? So if you have critical race theory, or I'm sorry, if you get rid of critical race theory, this notion of white privilege kind of goes away. It's just like, it's not a privilege. I live life like everybody else, and I don't have to feel guilty, or I don't have to be aware that inherently the way the system is set up that I benefit, right? But if I do get to know my neighbors and I get to know the people around me, if I am in a mixed race community, then now I have a bit more ability to be aware of when I see a bill that comes like this, I'm like, oh, it's not that big a deal. But if I'm talking to somebody like me regularly, I have relationships and I hear about this, I'm like, wait a minute, this is going to impact my neighbor, right? And I think that's what we have been missing for a very long time is many people, especially in America, do not care about a thing until it happens to them. We have seen that with the Affordable Care Act, the number of people that were anti-expansion of affordable care until they lost their job. And then like, I needed Obamacare, it was the only thing that saved my life. But until it darkened your door, you didn't care about it. And so I think when we're talking about things like this House bill and others, I really, really want us to recognize how similar this is to all of the Jim Crow laws that were introduced after Black people became free. This is the same playbook that just evolves over time. This is a control mechanism to say, the moment I see you advancing, the moment I see you becoming more free and gaining agency over your own history, over your own body, and becoming more aware and being willing to be vocal, I will find ways to legislate your ability to be quiet and to not be heard. And we are seeing that in anti-protest bills. We are seeing that in these conversations around critical race theory. We're seeing it around voting rights. It's the same playbook. We have to pay attention, and we need white folks to get involved in saying this can't happen. It cannot just be our fight.
Yeah.
Gosh, I tell you, I would love for more white people to study whiteness. I would really love that. And I'm not talking about studying American history. I'm talking about really studying the ways in which whiteness as a social construct was created, how it evolved, why it evolved, and what whiteness is. Like, I'd be really interested for whiteness studies to be more a part of our curriculum, because it's very illuminating for everyone. And I'm Black, so I would love for white people to study whiteness. And I would love to study more whiteness. With that being said, I want you to study whiteness because I want you to understand authentically how it is that whiteness became a fiction.
Mm.
So I have absolutely no idea why you would not like to understand Blackness. I guess I kind of get it, but these are fictions. And since you've made it a fiction, it should be something that we all study and that we all understand. So if you're not really allowing us to understand the fiction of race that you created, you're just inviting us to fall into even deeper and deeper disrepair. I want to understand how it is that the society that we live in became the way that it did based on race. I want to know that. Why? Because I live here.
Yeah.
And I'm a part of this democracy. Again, I keep going back to democracy because I do believe in it. I do believe in a deep democracy. I do believe in the sharing, the authentic sharing of power. I do believe in that. We haven't achieved that yet.
Right.
We're not there. But part of understanding what makes America America and what makes these dynamics that we're living in, this turmoil, what it is understanding whiteness and also understanding critical race. So why are you taking these things from us? Why are you afraid of the conversation? These are questions that we really need to be, all of us, asking one another.
Yeah. Powerful. What role, we're talking about lawmakers and what role is being played across the country and locally. to steer society and what we can and cannot discuss. What role does law enforcement play? Here in Cleveland, obviously, the consent decree was created years ago after the killing of Tamir Rice. However, we have seen a pattern with the Cleveland Police Department continue, where there isn't strong discipline within the department. There is a nonchalance in accountability and transparency to the community it serves. Minnesota, we have seen police reforms and funding alterations, and just recently Seattle come out and said it's lost 20% of its force in the past year. What role, Danielle, what role does policing play in a better community, in a more trusting and more equitable community?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Chris, we have to be having conversations about the police in this construct of like what has changed since the murder of George Floyd, because it was that interaction that led to this kind of awakening. What we also know is that the conditions in many communities lead to the belief that you need more police. And so thinking about communities that have come together and be able to take ownership of the fact that communities that have more resources tend to need less police because people have the things that they need. They're able to eat, they're able to feed their family, they have access to jobs, they have access to education. And so this notion that we are going to solve this societal problem without totally reimagining what safety forces actually look like. Again, I have to go back to the fact that since the murder of George Floyd, people have continued to be murdered by police and not with any type of rationale. And so we've got to get to the place where we have some federal legislation that does create some sense of norms in police departments. There's too much wild, wild west, in my opinion, of department by department in the state of Ohio. You could have a different interaction, department by department, city. If you're in the county, if I live in Cleveland, they're under a consent decree, but in Euclid, they may not be. And so the fact that somebody who has the freedom to move about between these different neighborhoods and community can be experiencing police that are trained differently, that believe differently, it's not okay. And I think that we recognize here locally, we don't have the same political will to do radical things. We tend to be a community that's much more, let's study and research, and let's look for the best practice to emulate, as opposed to digging in and being courageous to do something that we've never done before. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of confidence that under our current administration in the city of Cleveland, that we're going to see that. But I think that this must be a conversation in every interaction that we have with the individuals that are running for mayor in this upcoming election. Is like, what are you going to do with the Cleveland Division of Police? And I'll put one final plug before I shut up, that our next conversation around the Cleveland Division of Police consent decree, in partnership with United Way, NAACP, we're doing a monthly series. On June the 9th, we will be talking to the families of individuals who have been impacted by police misconduct. And so I want folks to tune in, because we have to hear these stories. We have to be reminded that before even Tamir died, we had these same type of issues in the Cleveland Division of Police, and we still have them today.
Yeah.
Danielle,
yeah, go ahead.
Danielle, I wanted you just touched on something. And you really touched on this really sort of culture in Cleveland of study and research, find best practices from other locales, from other parts of the country, and integrate those. Danielle, I'm wondering what because I've struggled with this. Where do you think that culture comes from? Why are we like that, do you think?
So my theory is we are a manufacturing town. We don't innovate, we build. So somebody else draws the blueprints and gives it to us, and we build it. We're afraid to go out of the box and innovate. And so it literally, I think, is a condition of the industries that built this city. You have lawyers, you have bankers, you have manufacturers, and people are risk averse. They're also concerned about, protecting assets. And then they're concerned, or their nature is to replicate what somebody else has already done. On the coast, they were designed to innovate. They've always been the ones that push the needle, so to speak. I do believe that we had innovation in our city at one point in time, and then we really became these manufacturers. But it happens in almost every single conversation I'm in. It's like, let's just rebuild what somebody else already did. That's what Cleveland believes is success.
That's a fascinating take. And yeah, I mean, it's industrial DNA, if you will, spanned across time. Fascinating take there.
Yeah.
And yeah, the spirit of innovation, right? All you have to do is look at Silicon Valley up through the Pacific Northwest to see how those cities have flourished in the past 20 years based on innovation. How far has Cleveland been able to come at the same time? Yeah. Daniel, what role does law enforcement, policing play? How does Cleveland get better? Obviously, Danielle alluded to it. She wants to hear from those in the mayoral race on what their plan is for the division of police. What do you think? What are your opinions?
Once again, it's part of it is I feel like there are some cultures that are really at war. I think that there is a really white supremacist element that is really hard to filter out of this police department and of most police departments. And so until we are really willing to deal with white supremacy in real time and for real, we're going to continue spinning our wheels.
Does it start at the top with the chief?
I think that it starts from the top up and the bottom down, from the bottom up and the top down.
Yeah.
I don't think it just starts at the top. I think that's important, but I also think it's important to work at the grassroots level. And part of that means that one of the things that I think that we have to continue to help do is change the narrative about how, and this is very grassroots, but change the narrative around just because you're a young person and you're aspiring to be a police officer, that doesn't mean becoming a snitch. What that means is that you are serving your neighborhoods so that more of these incidences don't happen. That's a foundational narrative that has to be transformed at the grassroots level. And that happens in neighbor to neighbor, brother to brother, sister to sister, sister to brother. That's how that happens. But that narrative has to change because we are not going to combat the effects of white supremacy just from the outside. We have to have more Black and brown and yellow brothers and sisters and red brothers and sisters wearing uniforms. But we have to change the narrative that that's you being a snitch. We got to change that. So there's that. But then I think that the other piece is, really engaging in authentic conversations once again with folks that live in the neighborhoods around what they believe good police practice looks like and to hear their stories. I think that that's very important, as well, for us to really hear the stories. And when I say that, hear the stories of some of the folks that interface with the police the most, which is our young people. We have to listen to them. And if we look at this George Floyd and post George Floyd moment, the folks that were on the streets, they're not 50, they weren't 50 years old like me. They were 15, 16, 19, 24, 27. These were the youth that were out on the streets, making their voices heard, trying to say, listen to me. I am tired of you doing this to me. And so there has to be a reckoning in the form of an authentic listening to young people. But it's also incumbent upon us to change the narrative about what police should look like.
Yeah, absolutely. In every conversation that we've had in these digital discussions, I've always asked our panelists at the end for a topical message to our viewers, be it when we talked about vaccination drives with Dr. Charles Maudlin and R.A. Vernon and what they would like to talk or what they'd like to say to their patients and their congregation and anyone else listening. So 1 month when we devoted it to stopping AAPI hate and the incomparable Margaret Wong, what she had to say to her community in the greater Cleveland area about Asiatown and how precious it is. I'd like to end both with you about as we're talking on this day, there is resonance, but as you noted, Danielle, it was temporal, it was fleeting. What must happen? What do you urge people to do tonight, tomorrow, the day after, a month after, and down the road?
So, Chris, I think that what I would encourage people to do is start by paying attention to organizations and communities. So you have 12 Literary Arts that's looking for additional support on ways that it can activate community and space. And when I say support, it doesn't mean to come in and take over, but literally like show up at their events when they have things going on, connect youth that you know in the community that are looking for ways to get involved and get engaged to their programming. They also have things for adults. I look at, we have Juneteenth coming up. We will be organizing again in Buckeye. 12 Literary Arts and Third Space Action Lab will be organizing in Glenville. You have folks that are organizing on Kinsman. And I would love to see the same energy of like support Black businesses, that none of this stuff can be a one-time thing. We are coming from such a deficit that in terms of community support, financially, showing up in spaces inside of organizations, you have to continue that same energy, and you cannot wait for the next time when something devastating happens to a marginalized group of people in order for you to show up for them. Know that our suffering has continued. It did not end with the murder of George Floyd. It only became more illuminated to people who weren't aware of what was going on. But if we want resolution, we have to be better neighbors. And I'm going to steal that from Daniel. I think it's something we have to be encouraging people to do. But the same energy and effort that we committed last year, find organizations in your community that are doing that work and support them. Give to your local NAACP, give to 12 Literary Arts, but also make sure if you are in spaces where you see injustice happening, be an advocate and say something. Don't wait for somebody else to step up and show up and be the leader. It may be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Everybody has an individual role in activism. You don't have to wait for a march or a protest to do that.
Yeah. Daniel?
Gosh, it's such a pleasure and a privilege to be in conversation with you, Danielle. And Chris, is so wonderful. Your humanity is just clear and transparent. And it's been great sitting on this call with you. I just want to say that it is incumbent upon us to understand that our young people are not very pleased with us. And they have very good reason not to be. Look at this world. We are on the brink of becoming the first generation to leave this world in worse shape than we received. Our young people are facing global racial reckoning. They are facing a global economic crisis. They're facing a global environmental crisis. And a pandemic, all at the same time. No one alive has seen this mixture of things. No one alive. So this world that we have left them, they're not pleased with us because they don't feel like we have kept them safe. And they have things to say about how to change that, because this is their experience. And so it's incumbent upon us to listen to them. Those of us that have boards, we must invite more young people to sit on the board. We must invite young people to the table, because when we do not allow them to the table, when we shut them out, we aren't listening to a very important part of our society that can help us answer the questions of this time. So I would say to you, stop thinking that youth are the answer to the future. That's true, but they are more importantly the answer to the present. So listen to them, because they're shaking you to listen to them. And there's a reason for that. We have not done the best job of being the best stewards of this world that we are supposed to leave them. So we must include them in answering the problems that we were ourselves have not been so great at answering. And that is a part of what this moment is all about. And that should not go undiscussed.
Yeah, great point. This conversation has been profound. It has had very pragmatic qualities as well. Above all else, incredibly powerful. And I want to thank you both sincerely from the bottom of my heart. And I know on behalf of my coworkers here at 19 News and the Cleveland Public Library who are watching right now online, they feel the same way. We work tirelessly behind the scenes. We meet every week, and we plan and map out months in advance. And to be able to have you both share so honestly with us tonight, I, again, can't thank you enough. As part of our partnership between 19 News and the Cleveland Public Library, for you at home, if you'd ever like to learn more about the topics we discuss, the Cleveland Public Library curates topic-specific reading lists that you can find on cpl.org. You can go anytime, and all of its branches as well. They have the next 400 branded areas within all of their brick and mortar locations where you can read and find information as well. We encourage you also to support 12 Literary Arts and Daniel's mission of empowering and mentoring youth. We encourage you to support the NAACP Cleveland, which continues to do yeoman's work in this struggle. Again, for Danielle and Daniel and all of us behind the scenes at 19 News and Cleveland Public Library, I'm Chris Tanaka. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a better tomorrow. Thank you.